I have found that the heroes of the faith, there are certain ones that people just gravitate to. There are ones like David that everybody seems to have an affinity for. But you know, the other one that is probably the most pronounced I have found is Joseph. People either want to align with or they have an affinity for that fulfillment of a dream and the blessing, or there's others that just can't imagine something like that. Such an amazing outcome could be theirs. But what we're going to share now is the story of Joseph is the story of us. The story of Joseph is truly the story of you and I. And as I just said, many people, they have an affinity for Joseph because they want to believe that through all the trials, God will fulfill those dreams and there will be this great blessing at the end. And I will admit, but that's been me many times. Then there's another group of people who just struggle to believe that God would do something so amazing in their life. But what we will see is the story of Joseph truly is the story of you and I. And it's what we're going to see as I share this is even though we may not go to prison, we may not go through what Joseph went through, God's purposes and principles are at work in my life and your life. God is doing certain things. And part of it is we do get the fulfillment. But what we're going to see is the fulfillment's a byproduct. But what I want to do is share with you understanding God's purposes and principles that I hope will encourage and strengthen you into living that God-powered life. So the story of Joseph starts in Genesis 37 if you want to go read it for yourself. But if you know the story, Joseph has a dream. And in the dream, his brothers bow down to him. Now, we could debate whether that was a good idea or not. But basically, it doesn't go well. In fact, they hate him for it. And he has the dream a second time, and his brothers and his parents bow down to him. Now, I'm going to share later why that second dream was so critical. But again, he shares it and it doesn't go well. Now, whether he should have or not, it's really kind of secondary. One of the things we're going to see is God was at work in the process. And why I want to share that is this. There are times when we're waiting for the fulfillment of something where we can look back and go, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I had handled that different. And you know what? Maybe we could have, but it doesn't matter at this point. Why? God's purposes are still in process. So don't get hung up on when we look back. Don't get hung up on those issues where, gosh, I wish I'd have done that different. Now, the things we realize, gosh, God, you weren't in that. We just repent. Sorry, God, but move on. Don't hang on to that because God's purposes are still going to be fulfilled. And we see that in Joseph, and this is so amazing. So his father sends him to go check on his brothers. They see him coming. And they say something really profound. Well, first off, they're plotting to kill him. But why? What it says is, and then let's see how his dream works out. See, they truly hated him and they wanted to kill the dream. Now, what happens? They don't kill him, but he does wind up sold into slavery, and he winds up a slave in Potiphar's house. Now, I'm going to go fast through this part of the story because you probably know it, and really what I want to focus on is the purposes and principles that you and I need. Now, while Joseph is the story of us, we might call this episode Keeping the Faith. See, although the setbacks looked increasingly like it's not going to happen, that it can't be fulfilled, what do we see? God was at work, God's purposes were there, and if we look, we will see even in our lives through the setbacks, God's blessing, His presence is with us even when it looks bleak. So Joseph is sold into slavery in Potiphar's house, but what happens? God is with him, and it's evident to the people around him. Now here's the thing, when you're waiting for the fulfillment of a dream, and if you continue to serve God, even if you don't sense it yourself, people around you can see God's presence. They can see His blessing. And it says Potiphar was blessed for Joseph's sake. But then it gets worse. And Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him. And what happens? He's thrown into prison. Now, this is where we could start to give up hope. We could start to question everything. Do you ever imagine Joseph sitting there going, that dream couldn't have been God? Now, as we'll see in a moment with Pharaoh when he interpreted the dream twice, why? See, what does it tell us in the New Testament? Out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let it be established. That second dream was confirmation that that was really from God. And that was important because, again, I know if I'm Joseph in prison at that point, you're going, that was not God. I absolutely missed that, and give up hope. But it says something really interesting. Now, this is in Genesis 39, and this is as Joseph is going into prison, not coming out. He's going into prison. And it says, God was with Joseph and showed him mercy. Now, in our natural mind, we would say, God, how is him going to prison? You're showing him mercy. Well, I want to challenge those couple of things. And this is a hard concept for us in the church today. People will really argue with you that God would not only allow these things to happen, but that God might be the architect behind them. I have a friend in the Netherlands who's a pastor named Seard, and that's what he calls it. God is the architect. He's not saying God did it, but God organized it. He's the architect. And what we'll see is both Joseph and David said God's the one that did this to him. Boy, that's a profound concept. Could it be that God is allowing the setbacks in our lives, the setbacks to our dreams, not to discourage us, but to build us into who he wants to be so he can do even more? But we'll see. Joseph literally says later, yeah, God did this. You didn't do this. God did this. Now, this was really important to me. I was going through the trial of a lifetime when God actually spoke that to me. You're talking about when he was going to prison, God was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And I felt like God was saying, I'm not making this any harder than it has to be. You know, when God's at work in our life, and this is where we want to be really real with God power. We don't want to do a fairy tale where, oh, it's just going to be easy. No, there are challenges that God allows. Why? He's developing us. But Joseph had to keep the faith, even though things looked increasingly worse. But we also see God gave him favor. The jailer was blessed for his sake. And then what I consider the final setback, the final discouragement. He has held on. He's been falsely accused. Nothing is working. And then he interprets the dream of the wine steward and tells him, you're going to be released in 3 days. And he says something we really got to grasp. He says, when you get out of here, remember me. I didn't do anything. Basically, he's saying, get me out of here. Imagine you've interpreted the guy's dream. He's released and he forgets you. I mean, has that got to be the pit of discouragement? Now, what we see is rapidly coming up. Pharaoh has a dream. Joseph interprets the dream, and Joseph goes from literally what I would consider the pit to the second in command of all of Egypt. That's the blessing we all look for. But what we'll see in the next episode is, by then Joseph realized it wasn't about him, that dream was just a glimpse of what God was going to do. We need to understand that those dreams, those things in your heart, they're just a glimpse. And in spite of the setbacks, in spite of it looking like there's no way this can happen, God is still at work. So I will quickly share a personal story. Normally I wouldn't share this, but I think it really helps understand how, in spite of everything getting worse, God's at work. So I was single, wanted to be married, but I traveled constantly. I was flying like 100,000 miles a year. And I'm getting older, and I'm finding nobody. And I finally had to get to the point where I just said, okay, God, I give up. I give it to you. I'm not looking to the left. I'm not looking to the right. I'm only going to do what you gave me to do. And if you want me married, you have to put her right in front of me. And at this point, I frankly was starting to give up hope. You know, I'm in my late 30s, and I'm gone all the time. Who wants this guy? But God was at work. And you know what? God's at work in your life and my life. And the blessing, the breakthrough, Joseph had no idea that the next morning Pharaoh had a dream and needed somebody to interpret it. He had no idea that next morning everything was going to change. Well, in my life, I had some people who was bugging this woman who is now my wife. They bothered her for 9 months to call me. I had no idea. I didn't see that for 9 months God was at work behind the scenes bringing me the most amazing wife. God's at work in my life and your life, just like he was in Joseph. And even when it doesn't look like anything's happening, when it doesn't look like you're making progress, he's still at work. His purposes are still at work. So here's the three things I want to share with us. Number one, keep the faith. Even when we make mistakes, even when we look at it and say, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that, don't hold on to it. Let it go. Why? God's purposes will be fulfilled. Number two, even when there's setbacks, realize God is the architect. Again, his purposes will be fulfilled. And I do want to share one last one. Just something I have learned. You know, those dreams, be careful who you share those dreams with. There are those that, well-meaning, but they will look at it in the natural and just say, there's no way. That child that you're praying back into the fold, whatever that relationship, whatever it might be, there are those that can't see beyond the natural. They just don't have that same faith. And what happens? It just can suck the faith, the confidence right out of you. So be careful who you share your dreams with. Now, I'm not saying don't share them with anyone, but just recognize you have family and friends who they love you, but they just don't have the faith to stand with you. God's purposes, God's plans will be fulfilled. And what you're going to see is that dream you have is just a glimpse of what God has. And what we're going to see is God's plans and purposes are not about us, and the blessing is just a byproduct. So watch for the next episode as we dig into this a little bit deeper.